Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson with Life Along the Merrimack. This is a podcast where we talk about the health and the history of the Merrimack River. And today I have some slides that, we don't just talk about the river, we're going to show the river. But first I wanted to mention an interesting event I went at. More than 60 people were there for an online presentation on how to make the river cleaner, how to make more people aware of it. And so it was a situation where you had a lot of concerned people talking about what we frequently talk about, which is the river, its history, its value to the community. And among those were State Rep Jim Kelcourse, State Senator Diana DiZoglio, many people in government, many people who are involved in such ways as estuaries or fishing interests, sewage control plants. There were some people there, and that's very important. One of the things that came out in this 2-hour meeting is people are concerned, I think at the end of the day, about getting more funding to clean up the river and to keep it clean, and also having a greater component for public education. A lot of people don't know that the Merrimack River is in a difficult situation. And when I say that, it's largely because when there are heavy rains, the rainwater goes into the sewage treatment plants. It merges with the effluent. It becomes overflowed. The sewage treatment plant can't take anymore. And then it lets everything go. So that means a lot of raw sewage goes into the river. And those of us at the end of the river in Newburyport, Amesbury, Salisbury, Haverhill, we're the ones who become aware of this because there are numerous plants that do this, including Manchester, New Hampshire, Nashua, New Hampshire, Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill. So there are many communities that have systems where if it gets too much rainwater, then the effluent overflows. So that was an important element of today. So maybe in the future, we'll be learning more. I must say that this is a tough time to be talking about funding. Everyone's concerned about the virus, about unemployment checks, about making the economy right. So that is not quite figured out. And we, have a federal administration that doesn't seem interested in cleaning up rivers. Nevertheless, more than 60 people came to that event. I was there. As I say, it was virtual, it was on Zoom. So, but it's interesting to hear people talk about it. There's a lot of work being done. So I want, on this note, I want to talk about the river, how beautiful it is, and also talk about the past as well. One of the reasons Newburyport became a great shipbuilding area and a great port is because we're on the Atlantic Ocean. Here you can see to the left is Plum Island, to the right is Salisbury Beach. And to both sides, as you can see, there are jetties. Now, several years ago, each jetty was rebuilt for about $10 million each. That was federal money. It's unclear whether it's completely worked because some parts of Plum Island say they get more sand now and others say they're losing their sand. But this is what the opening looks like, and it's a remarkable place, as you can tell. You can see on the left side with the red roof is the old Coast Guard station. And it's used to be until 1973, where the Coast Guard kept rescue boats. But erosion came along, bad weather came along, and so they moved it in about 1973 to Water Street. As you can see, though, the building is still there. The auxiliary, Coast Guard auxiliary meets there once a month. And in that area, there's also a voting booth for part of Ward 1. But this is a remarkable photo. The marshland you see on the upper right is part of a huge marsh. It's the largest one in New England, actually, 25,000 acres. And so this is what uh, it looks like from a very high airplane, and there are numerous boats here as well. When we talk about Newburyport, it was the most prosperous shipbuilding port in the colonies in the late 18th century. You can see these enormous vessels here. This painting was by Richard Burke Jones, who is a wonderful painter who lives here in Newburyport. Beyond that, he's a city clerk. But look at, he's a great historian also. Look at how much work he's done to build these, to put together and show how large the ships were. I mean, ships were larger than buildings, as you can see. And this is what Newburyport looked like in about 1853. There's tremendous commerce with the West Indies, with China, India, and also with Russia. We got metals from Russia and crafts and spices and things like that from Russia. So, Newburyport vessels went all over the world. This is an example of a ship being built. This was the Simonton in about 1893, built here in Newburyport, one of the last tall ships to be built here. And it's a situation where this was the launching. People got dressed up. There were hundreds of people, as you can see. And again, look at the size of the vessel, close to 300 feet, 500,000 tons, 500 tons, and 4 masts. Is one of the largest of its day. Now, one of the challenges with Newburyport's harbor is it was shallow. It was shallow 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and it's still shallow. So towards 1893, when this was built, ships could go out loaded with cargo. So that's basically what put Newburyport out of the building picture. It was curious, several years ago, there was a Spanish vessel who came here to Newburyport, and it was outside the harbor for several hours. And the kids were on Plum Island and everyone's getting impatient because they could see it. But it was a situation where the captain was waiting for the highest tide possible. It was a she, had known that it was only a 16-foot draft at its best time. So she kept waiting and waiting until, the vessel was ready to go over in high tide. As she told me, and I interviewed her because I was a reporter for the Daily News at that time, she said, I know people were impatient, but I was not about to get grounded right in front of all these people. And needless to say, the AP would have picked it up. It would have been in many photos in newspapers. And so she said, I waited, but I had to get to the high tide. And again, you can see to the left, some of the work being done. And, this is full employment in Newburyport in those days. Most everything was made here. The sails, the interior, the wood was done here. A lot of the caulking, much of the metal work was done here. Newburyport was prominent in part because the city could get logs from way up on the Merrimack River. The river is 117 miles long, and trees were felled in New Hampshire and other parts of Massachusetts all the time. And we were one of the few communities that they could float them down. And of course, I would say when the mills came to Lowell in the 1820s and 1830s, and they started putting dams up, that did make it difficult to get the wood down here. But they did make small canals and locks, and so the wood still came down. So as you wonder, well, why was it Newburyport that became a great shipbuilding community? One of the reasons was access to timber. It could float down from New Hampshire. It could float down from um, northern Massachusetts and other places. So we were lucky in that sense. And we were just talking about floating down. We're talking about the river. This is the Pawtucket Falls in Lowell. It's a huge falls, very wide. It fell up to 30 feet in certain parts. And because it had a great fall and because it could create hydropower, Lowell became one of the great mill communities in the country. So that gets us almost 2 centuries. Beyond that, Lawrence was put together in about 1848. It became a community at that time. So 1822 for Lawrence, 1848 for Lowell, 1848 for Lawrence. So this was a situation. They had the hydropower. They had the technology and the mills, learned about mass production. So the textiles, the cotton would come up from the deep south on rails eventually, and it'll be put into cloth here. Henry David Thoreau, however, the great poet and naturalist, was very upset. Even way back in 1839, he and his brother took a paddle and he wrote a book called A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. And, when he got to Lowell, the Concord River was wonderful. He happened to love that. But when he got to the Merrimack River, and remember, the mill started in the 1820s, this is 1839, he said, this is not good. The fish can't get upstream. They can't migrate to their, the places they have to go to spawn. These mills are putting sewage into the river. And he made this comment. He said, maybe if the fish can last thousands of years until the mills have disappeared, they'll have a chance once again. Excuse me. So that was quite a remark way back in 1839. And the Merrimack was full of salmon, but it also was replete with sturgeon. And sturgeon, they say there's a few in the river now. I suppose there are, but it used to be, really, there used to be thousands of them, but they couldn't get upriver. They couldn't spawn. So we kind of lost our sturgeons along the way. The Spigot River in Lawrence hosted many mills. And as you can see, there's many mills off on the left side of the waterway here. And it seems like a bit of air pollution. I'm sure there was quite a bit of water pollution as well. The Spigot River runs into the Merrimack. And one of the things about this great building surge and the creation of the mills is it brought many immigrants to the Merrimack Valley. Now, nowadays, immigration is a political issue. It was back then, and I'm talking late 19th century, say 1870 to 1920. And, Italians came here, Jews from Europe came here, Albanians, Armenians, Irish, many French Canadians came here. So if you live in the Merrimack Valley, it's possible that you have ties and grandparents who are connected to the great time when people were filling the mills. And although it is said that the mills were exploitive, which they were, it also gave many European immigrants a place to work, and that is not a small thing. So this is the Spigot River. It's in Lawrence. It's a wonderful shot, I think, and it shows it black and white and what a mill town looked like. The mill clocks, and here's one from Lawrence, Massachusetts. It was one of the largest in the world. It's still standing, by the way. And community clocks let workers know what time it was, of course, and when their shift started. So this is a situation where many people's lives revolved around the shift at the mill. And the mills actually, again, mills could be good because many mills in New England permitted the mothers to bring small children there. I mean, this was the first daycare that I can think of, at least on the industrial sense. And the mothers would say, take a break. Say they got there at 8. Maybe they took a lunch break, so they could go into the children's room from noon to 1, say. Now, we're used to that idea now. That wasn't prevalent then, except, they needed the women to work. The women did not have what we call daycare, so they brought them there. I spoke to a woman, this is several decades ago. She was French-Canadian, and she remembered coming down with her mother. She was 10 years old. This is in Westbrook, Maine, in a factory there, and she in the mill there, and she remembered having fun there. She had playmates at the mill. She stood on them. Nowadays, of course, there's child labor laws, there's workman's comp laws, there's all sorts of things. But she remembered it as a pretty good time. Manchester, New Hampshire, if you've been there, even by the standards of Lawrence and Lowell, have enormous mills. I was there this week, as a matter of fact, taking some photos, and they've done a terrific job in taking old mills and repurposing them for you manufacture, software manufacture. But this is a shot from 1936, and this shows the flood of 1936. And this was not just the Merrimack. I've seen pictures of the Connecticut River, 1936, of the Androscoggin River in Maine and the Kennebec River in Maine. It was an enormous flood. But look at all the destruction taking place. It's truly, a wonderful photo. The Amoskeag mill was reputed to be the largest in the world in the late 19th century and early 20th. By 1936, things had changed a bit, but look at the size of the mills, and of course, look at the size of the Merrimack River. Here is a shot of the Merrimack, and I think it's similar to the one we just saw, but I like this because you can see the sandbar. Navigators, boaters, even today, often run around on the sandbar, and you can see why. And all the way going back centuries, people have written about it. It moves frequently. So, in 3 years, it might not be in the same place. But even now you hear people who don't know about it, low tide particularly, they'll find themselves on the sandbar. Newburyport now has many vessels that go out, all the time. And there are 1,500 vessels that are recreational boats that are tied up in Newburyport, Amesbury, and Salisbury. So that's an enormous amount. Why so many city officials and state leaders want to make sure the river stays clean. If this gets dirty as it was a century ago, you're going to lose your boating, you're going to lose some of the restaurant trade, you're going to lose shopping, and just the whole idea of recreation on the Merrimack River would change considerably. There's pretty good fishing now. There's sailboats actually go out. You might know the American Yacht Club right on the river. That sends small sailboats out. So having a very good, a safe river and a clean river is important for the economic viability of Newburyport, Amesbury, Salisbury. I mean, they have hundreds of campsites out. And so some people actually go into the river, some people fish in the river. And of course, any discussion right now of recreational opportunities during the virus as we have, are always there's a huge asterisk. We don't know exactly what's happening. Salisbury was closed down, the tenting area, it will be open soon. Boating was slowed down for quite a while. But I was down on the dock recently in Newburyport. Fishing boats are here. There's a half dozen. And there are many boats as well that are here waiting to go out on weekends. So it's a viable area at 16 feet at high tide. And people have to be aware of that sandbar. The Merrimack is a fine place to keep a boat. And this is taken a couple weeks ago. You can see, the many boats are tied up there. Not every boat was in at this point. This was taken in late May. But it does show that even though we know about a lot of forest here in the Merrimack, and there's a lot of good boating opportunities. This is near Hatter's Point in Amesbury. And I don't know if you folks remember in the old days, but Hatter's Point was a hat making shop and was in disrepair, as many old mills are. And in the last decade or two, developers came in and really made a nice condo project. It's right past the park there near the marina. And these boats are attached to Hatter's Point. And, there are many houses along the Merrimack River. There was going to be a pretty large condo development right along the river in Newburyport. The Karp family was thinking of 200 condos and perhaps a hotel. That's between Michael's Harborside and the old Black Cow. Right now, it's not known how that's coming along. With all the economic uncertainty, perhaps it won't move forward. But people have always loved the river, and Hatter's Point is an example of something that worked. The Merrimack, again, is what I'm trying to stress here is that even though we talk about mills and we talk about pollution, there are many parts of it that are so wonderful. And this certainly looks to be one of them. This is pretty near Maudsley State Park, would be across the way. So there's a lot of natural beauty to be had in the park in Amesbury on Main Street. There are some of the most beautiful views of the river anywhere. So I think people are aware of how beautiful it is. And this is an example of what's still out there. Here we have kind of a elongation of one thing we started to talk about. The federal government has become interested in the Merrimack River. The National Park Service in Lowell has one of the most extensive museums and parks in the country that look back on the history of textile museums. And they look back on the creation of locks and canals in Lowell that permitted the Industrial Revolution and permitted Lawrence and Haverhill to grow and really change a lot on the North Shore. Here's a vessel that runs in the summer. There are hundreds of thousands, well, let's just say many thousands of visitors to the park in Lowell each summer. Again, this is the era of the virus, so it's been closed, but it will be open again. But they go down the river and they're part of what's happened in terms of learning more, learning about the history of the mills, the history of the river itself, because as I mentioned, many changes occurred. And as a result of the river, many people came, many textile mills were created, mills and locks were made. And so here's an example of some people going out and learning about the past. So that is what I'm talking about today. I'm, glad to be here. We finished a little early today. I'm going to be doing this again. And, but as I say, I went to a meeting this morning. This is Life Along the Merrimack, the podcast, and more than 60 people were there, and they were stressing the fact that we have to, create more funding so we can improve our sewage treatment plants. We have to make a greater effort for education so the people in this area know what's happening. And so if there's bills, then they can support a bill or some funding to improve the cleanup of the river. And so it's going to take a long time. I have been amazed at how many organizations are involved. And public administration, I took many courses in this area, plus I've covered 1,000 meetings of governmental agencies. I mean, there are many moving parts and there are many meetings and there's much discussion. But the meeting this morning, the Merrimack River Commission was, very, very positive. A lot of people are working on it. And if you're in the Merrimack Valley, as we are, you're probably interested in the future of the river itself. So we'll be talking about that in the future. I'll be back next week at 2:00. I think I'm going to add some slides. I was up in Manchester this week. I was in Lowell. I was in Lawrence taking photos. So I'm going to try to get some more slides, add to what we have, because most people don't spend their life on the river. I mean, I'm doing it now because I'm writing a book, and the book is called Merrimack, the Resilient River. So I spend almost every day in some form on the river. But most people don't. And I think it's interesting to look at some of the elements that we don't get to see regularly. Next week, I'm going to have some slides from Franklin, New Hampshire. That's where the Merrimack begins. It was a mill town, but it was a paper mill town. So I find that interesting because everything downriver was textile mills. But it's where the Winnipesaukee stream comes in and meets another stream. And that's where the Merrimack starts. And that's 117 miles upriver in Franklin, New Hampshire, which is where Daniel Webster was from, the Devil and Daniel Webster. You'll recall that, of course. So that is what I'm going to try to do for next week. Have some slides of upcountry, New Hampshire, Manchester, and because we're part of a very large waterway. And as is mentioned, Newburyport is at the tail end. And Mayor Donna Holliday, Mayor of Newburyport, frequently says that. She said, there's a lot of things that go on upriver, and we're at the end. So if there's a big lot of effluent in the river, we're the ones who get the tail end of it. And so she's working hard. The council in Newburyport is working. And I think everybody is trying to figure out how they can get ready to make a better river. So that's it for me. I'm Dyke Hendrickson. This has been Life Along the Merrimack. We'll gather again, and I hope to have more slides and more discussion of the path. Thank you very much for joining us.